Hi, everyone. Welcome to Changing Minds, the series that explores the psychology and neuroscience of human behavior. I'm your host, Joe Devlin. Normally, meeting up with other people is rewarding. We find great pleasure in seeing our friends and family in person. At the moment, though, the thought of face-to-face interaction can cause a great deal of anxiety because of the risk of exposure to COVID. In fact, there was a great article in the food section of The Guardian last week about this. Grace Dent said, "It's not the sunbathers the government should fret over. It's the millions of us that'll need to convince, once this is over, to come out blinking into the light." I like that because I really think she captured this kind of new type of social anxiety that so many of us are facing. To discuss this with me today is Dr. Lasana Harris, Associate Professor of Social Neuroscience at UCL. Welcome, Lasana.
Hi, Joe. Thanks for having me.
I'm really delighted you could join us. Thank you very much. Before we get started, I'd just like to remind our audience members to share any questions that you have for Lasana in the Q&A board as we go along. So, Lasana, when I was thinking about this, I guess I'm pretty fortunate because I still like to go out. I mean, going for a run or going to the grocery store gets me out of the house and I enjoy seeing other people. But I can see in some people's faces this sort of fear and anxiety when they see me. And that's kind of disconcerting. What's going on there?
It's actually very interesting, right? Because as you said in the introduction, when we see other people, that's usually a source of reward. So as human beings, we enjoy the presence of others. And that typically has lots of benefits for us. It allows us to interact with other people. We derive benefit from those interactions. And so evolutionarily speaking, people have always been a positive stimulus, if you will, a source of great joy and reward. However, people are also threatening in many different ways. They can be physically threatening. So if you encounter someone in a dark alley at night, you might find that you have a bit of a fear response towards them instead of a positive response. But people can also be dangerous in the sense that they carry pathogens. And that's the type or the source of the kinds of anxiety that you might be seeing in people currently. So as you walk around your neighborhood, you're typically in a safe space, unless it's a particular time of day or you're encountering particular groups of people that you've already thought of as threatening. But now we're having this type of threat response to everyone because of this fear of contamination. So the emotion that's actually driving this isn't fear necessarily, but it's disgust. Specifically, it's something we call contamination disgust, which is interesting because disgust is a type of fear. And so when people are experiencing these emotions, instead of making a disgust face, you're seeing anxiety on their faces because the fear element of disgust is really prominent during this time.
So what are they disgusted by? Are they disgusted by this idea of contamination? And is that the source here?
Exactly. And so disgust has many functions. When it first evolved, it really came about to keep us away from pathogens and other contaminants. So think of disgust as the emotion that protects the body envelope, as we say. So if there are things that you can ingest, for instance, bad food that might make you upset or in worst cases may lead to death, you have a disgust response in part to expel those things from your body. So if you think about what disgust is associated with, you might think about vomiting after a night of heavy drinking, for instance. That's your body's attempt to expel the pathogen, right? In this case, the alcohol. But disgust is also evolved to keep us away from diseases, right? Because these are other things that can enter the body envelope and cause us harm. And so we have this evolved mechanism which keeps us away from things that are harmful. Now, pathogens are very interesting because we can't see them. So we might be able to see a bit of rotten food and we can smell it and taste it and know that there's something strange about it. But when it comes to pathogens, they're invisible to us. And so we have to infer their presence. And we infer their presence typically under normal circumstances by looking at whether someone displays symptoms of the type of person who might be sick. So if you see someone walking down the street and they're sneezing or coughing, that's an evolutionary sign that they may have a pathogen. You may be more likely to avoid them. But what's happened now because of COVID, particularly because of the fact that you might be infected and show no symptoms, is we've gone beyond those cues that we would typically use. So the person who's coughing has always been a bit threatening and disgusting to us. But now even people that aren't showing signs of having the disease are also being perceived as threatening. So what our minds have done is they've imagined the possibility that anyone can be a threat, anyone can be dangerous. And so we're finding ourselves now reacting to people in ways that we didn't typically react to people before. And that's what makes going outside, I think, very difficult for some people because of this imagined fear that they have tied to this very basic emotion necessary for our survival.
That makes a lot of sense, and I'm just thinking about that. And I guess maybe in sort of day-to-day non-COVID life, there are examples of this with people like homeless people, I guess, right? Because you often see people sort of step out of the way, right? Where I'm assuming at a rational level, they're probably relatively harmless.
Exactly. So disgust is one of, I think, the more fascinating emotions in that sense. And so we've tagged particular outgroups as being more likely to contain pathogens, for instance, or carry pathogens, homeless people being a classic example. But also historically, migrants have been viewed that way as well, right? Because they may be coming from a different country or a different culture, and with them, they bring pathogens. And so the types of reactions you see against homeless people or migrants, we think those have always existed in human history. What's interesting about disgust, though, is that we've taken it beyond the pathogen world and carried it into the moral domain. So when we think about people that might be morally contaminating, for instance, we also display a disgust response. So disgust is actually a big component of things like a prejudice response. So if I have a particular implicit bias against certain types of groups, religious groups, or ethnic groups, part of that has a disgust flavor to it as well. And so this emotion, which we're now experiencing constantly, has always typically been reserved for what we like to call those people on the fringes of humanity, those people whom we consider to be very different from us. They could be immigrants, they could be homeless people, but now we're having this sort of immigrant and homeless reaction to everyone. And that's really what's changed for a lot of us. And again, that's not how we evolved as human beings, right? Because people will often our most positive source of reward, and now they're sort of all being viewed through this disgust lens.
I mean, that seems remarkable to me, excuse me. Is it kind of a contagious fear? Is it something that if you start observing it, you're more likely to exhibit it yourself, a bit like we've seen with panic buying?
Exactly, because disgust is a type of fear, it operates via very similar mechanisms. So if you look in the brain, you can dissociate the two emotions, but there is some overlap in the brain regions. And one thing we know particularly well in the fear literature is that you can learn fears vicariously. So for instance, lots of people are afraid of snakes, but they've probably never had an encounter with snakes themselves. But we've learned or we've associated this fear of snakes partially because we've seen other people display a fear response to snakes. Now, there are lots of people in the emotion literature that will argue that the fear of snakes is what we call the prepared response. It's a response we have to a prepared stimuli. That simply means that over our evolutionary history, we've seen lots of people be killed by snakes. And so baked into our genetics is this fear response to snakes. Baked in similar ways are disgust responses to particular things. So if you think about vomit or feces, right, most people have seen over evolutionary history that these kinds of things carry pathogens and are potentially quite harmful. So if you simply observe other people displaying this type of fear response when they're encountering other people, they're sort of doing the social distancing dance, as I call it, right? When you're walking down the street and people are trying to cross away from you to maintain their 2 meters. Even little children, I assume, are picking up on that as a type of social learning. And so I often give the story of my daughter who's 3 years old, and she loved sort of going out in the streets and meeting other people and saying hi. She's a very friendly kid. But now she's terrified of going outside because she's seen us avoiding other people now for weeks. And so she's vicariously learned that other people potentially are now threatening, regardless of who they are. And so we're definitely spreading the fear of disgust as well, in addition to things like panic buying. So because they're operating along very similar mechanisms, and because these are evolutionary, very old phenomena, it's very difficult for us to shake these emotional feelings. And so what I think you've witnessed now is that the majority of the population is terrified of each other, right? We're terrified of face-to-face interactions, when it used to bring us so much joy a few short months ago.
It's a remarkable change in such a short period of time. I mean, just yesterday I was walking back to my house over like a little footbridge that isn't very wide, to be honest. And there was a young family with a 2 or 3 year old on the bridge. And the little girl sort of pushed herself all the way to the side and said, "Make room for the people." I assume she meant me, but it was striking to hear it, from a basically a very young one. Lasana, one of the things I said in the introduction was that you're a social neuroscientist, and you've mentioned how some of these things happen in the brain. Could you maybe briefly explain what is social neuroscience? How would you even measure something like that?
Very good question. So social neuroscience is essentially the study of social phenomena like a fear of other people using the tools of neuroscience. So using things like brain imaging or physiological responding. And the way we study emotions in general is we look for physiological markers to know that they're actually occurring. So the way most emotion researchers define emotion is that there's some type of bodily response that we can measure using a variety of techniques. For Disgust, one of our favorite measures is something we call facial EMG, which means we put little electrodes on your face and we look at the muscles in your face as they move. Now, again, what's interesting about Disgust is because it's this response to a contaminant, the way your face moves during the experience of disgust is actually trying to block out, for instance, chemicals from getting into your body. And so a disgust facial expression like this means that you flare your nostrils, which means you close the backs of your nostrils from chemicals coming in. And so we can measure the muscle that's responsible for that flaring of nostrils. And in previous studies we have done in people in other labs, what we've discovered is that you can use this type of measurement and you can give someone something bitter to taste and they make the disgust face and we can pick it up. But you can also show them things like behavior they consider sexually reprehensible and you make the same type of disgust face. We can ask you to imagine being in a pandemic and again, people make the same types of disgust face. So we're using the same mechanism for all of these things that are potentially harmful. What separates disgust from fear in general is that oftentimes in fear, the threat isn't necessarily to the body envelope, but disgust is unique in that way because disgust has this component that we call interoception, which is essentially the idea that we tap into how we're feeling, how our body feels. And so if you've ever eaten bad food or had some type of stomach bug, you know that it really starts down there, right in the pit of your stomach. And that's really the core of the disgust response because again, it's monitoring your internal state to tell whether you're contaminated or not. And so as we move around in this COVID world, right, we're having this fear, disgust reaction towards other people. We may or may not have the sort of pit of the stomach response, but I'm sure lots of people are. And what's happening as we've sort of gone forward is that people are now becoming what we call habituated to this response. So my real concern as we move forward is that the longer we stay with COVID dominating everything, the more we'll become habituated to this emotional response. And so we may begin thinking not of people as rewarding stimuli, but thinking of people as stimuli that elicit this disgust response. And that's very unprecedented, I think, in human history. So social neuroscience allows us to study things like that because without asking people questions about what they feel, we can look at how their body responds, how their brain responds, and get information about these very social questions.
And is it the same for everyone? I mean, I'm sensitive to the fact that I don't seem to be experiencing this much, and that could just mean that I'm a bit dim and that I don't recognize the threat, but I feel like I recognize the threat. But like I look at what's happening in the U.S. with these protests about lockdowns, and there's certainly a class of society that seems to think that the threat isn't from this pandemic. The threat is from the government. So I'm assuming that they're less worried about being around other people if they're willing to go out and protest like that.
Yeah, so I think there are two answers to that question. The first answer is yes, there's an individual difference. We call it disgust sensitivity. So some people are what we might call in popular culture germaphobes, right? They're disgusted by the slightest thing, whereas other people would go a very long way before they start feeling disgusted. So it reminds me of the show Fear Factor, which ran in the US for a long time. And there were just some people who were really good at doing these horrible things like eating cockroaches and what have you, and other people who couldn't stand the thought of it. So we all have individual difference there. And that individual difference has been related to lots of stuff. So for instance, people who tend to be very narcissistic tend to be very disgust sensitive, which makes sense, right? If you're concerned about yourself and you think that you're better than everyone else, then you think the value of your body is higher. And so you're more alert for signs of danger. Let's put it that way. There are lots of other things that correlate with disgust sensitivity as well, lots of other individual difference factors. The other interesting thing that's happening, the other explanation or answer for your question, especially in the case of the American protesters, is the fact that disgust often occurs to things that we don't see, right? Because we can't see pathogens. And one of the most effective ways we know of regulating emotions is just to think differently about them. And so if I make myself believe that this virus is just a common cold, and it really isn't that threatening, then I won't display a disgust response to it. And that's possible because I'm not even seeing it. Now, we know even if you're showing me something, I can think differently and change emotional response. It's that much easier to do if there's nothing to see. And so it's very easy for people to lead themselves to believe that the virus isn't threatening, therefore they won't display the disgust response. They'll be less likely to adhere to social distancing, for instance. So I think that's something you saw quite a bit, for instance, in younger people when the pandemic first set in. The original media we got in the stories essentially said that this was something that affected older people. So younger people thought this isn't a threat to me, and so they went about ignoring social distancing. However, it's very possible for any of us to start thinking differently about the virus, which isn't necessarily the smartest thing to do, given that it is actually quite a deadly virus. But that's one of the ways you can make your walks outside a little bit better, right? You can think that I'm protected. I have on my mask and I don't touch my face, and I'm doing all of the things necessary so that I no longer feel as threatened when I go outside. So I reinterpret what's happening by simply thinking differently about it. Now, that's easier said than done. It takes a little bit of practice, and there's lots of evidence that things like mindfulness and meditation helps you think differently. But it is very possible for you to have a different reaction to the pandemic. And so I think the people that you see that aren't social distancing are the ones who are either really low on disgust sensitivity, or they're the ones that have completely reinterpreted what's happening and they don't read it as a threat to the same extent.
And does that affect how contagious the idea of this disgust is? I mean, when you measure the contagion of disgust and how it moves through society and communities, do you find that there are pockets that are less affected because of those kind of factors, or is that something that just gets lost in the overall society measurements?
I think it has a lot to do with who you're learning from. So for instance, in the American context, again, the people that are protesting all belong roughly to the same in-group, right? They all view themselves as similar. And you're more likely to learn emotional reactions from people you perceive as more like you. And so if people who are like me out there in the world aren't having a disgust response to this thing, I'm less likely to have a disgust response to this thing. So if people are caught in media bubbles, let's say, where all of the information they're getting is suggesting this isn't a threatening virus, and it's very easy for them to think that this is something that's not threatening and fail to show that contamination disgust. So I think the rate of contagion really moves within the groups that you belong to. And if you belong to groups that are paranoid, you're more likely to be paranoid about the pandemic. And if you're not, you're less likely to be so. So it really matters who you're talking to in this time. Where's your information coming from? That's really going to affect how you feel about the disgust and the virus itself. So for me personally, the worst thing I can do before I go outside is read the news, right? Because it's usually covered with all of these terrible stories of the disease. So I'll try to set that aside for a couple of hours and then go outside, and I usually feel a lot better. But if I'm sort of looking at Twitter right before I head out the door, it's going to be a terrifying experience, because in my networks, people are simply just talking about the horrible things associated with the virus.
Yeah, that really resonates, because I've stopped watching quite as much news because it seems so grim, and there's very little that's being said other than the sort of death count keeps going up. And maybe that's helping me maintain my fictitious environment in my head that I'm fine, I'm safe.
Yeah.
So that's a great hack, though. I like that. So people are sort of slow down on the news, perhaps right before going out. You have these kind of mindfulness approaches that people can use to also help. Are there other things that come to mind that that we can all do on a sort of personal level?
Yeah. So again, one of the other very effective emotion regulation strategies is something we call distraction. So basically, you take your mind off of it. So if you're not paying attention to what's happening around you, you won't feel the anxiety and the fear as much because of the disgust. Um, and this is basically related to the idea that we need some type of cognitive capacity to process emotion. So if my mind is overloaded thinking about other things, there's no room left for me to sort of process the disgust and feel as bad. Um, there's another strategy which doesn't work as well called suppression, which is basically we try to pretend that we don't have the emotion. So we push it down and we hope that it goes away. And that's very effective in the short term. So it might allow you to go for your walk outside. But what happens with suppression is you get a rebound, and it comes back sometimes much stronger than the original emotional experience. So I don't really recommend pretending everything is okay. But I think there are these other strategies you can use. You can distract yourself, and you can reappraise the situation, and that's going to help, I think. And you can also limit the learning, the vicarious learning, because again, most of us haven't been infected with the virus, right? And so we don't have that direct experience of how dangerous this thing is. And even if we have been infected and it's been mild, we may not think it's as threatening as before. That may allow us to reduce sort of the fear of going out. So there are some strategies I think that might be useful.
Right. No, that's fantastic and really helpful. If it's okay with you, Lasana, I'd love to turn to some audience questions. Is that all right?
Sure. Yeah.
Well, I see here one from Katie saying, can we use disgust to explain the increased racism towards people of Asian descent in the Western world, or even the increased racism towards people of African descent in China right now?
Exactly. Because disgust is part of this prejudice response, if we're feeling, and because all of these different types of disgust, be it moral or pathogen avoidance or sexual or what have you, they all depend on the same mechanism, then it's quite easy to imagine how prejudice can sort of spiral out of control. So if I'm already feeling tons of disgust because I'm worried about the disease, and that's the same feeling I have when I think about a particular outgroup that I might have prejudice against. It's easy to see how prejudice is going to now spike. And that's what we're seeing, I think, in China, for instance, with the disgust and the sort of bias towards people of African descent, because again, there you have lots of prejudice happening that way. There have been reports in the UK, for instance, of increases in sort of police profiling during this time, again, because of the disgust response. And what we're seeing in the US with the sort of right-wing protesters coming out, again, is being fueled by this as well. And so when Donald Trump tries to call this a Chinese virus, for instance, right, what he's doing there is using prejudice responses people may have against Chinese people to boost the sort of combined with the fear and disgust we're all feeling now in the time of the virus to really push and I think put blame elsewhere. So I think prejudice and disgust, because they go hand in hand, there's always this danger of things getting a lot worse in that sense.
Inder has a really nice follow-up here and says, post-COVID, do you expect that we'll see more or less racial discrimination?
I could go both ways on that, right? And so the optimist in me can say, yeah, we've learned to sort of care for each other and share in the stuff that Nicola was talking about a couple of weeks ago, the cooperation in the local level. That's happened a lot more, so we might be a fairer society. But the realist and the cynicist in me says it's going to get much worse. So I think you're going to see spikes in hate crimes. You're going to see a lot more discrimination because the virus is going to hang around for quite some time, and that's going to give us lots of opportunities for learning. And if we associate particular groups with being infected in the way that we have historically for migrants, for instance, then I think it's going to be much harder to sort of make further gains in the arenas of prejudice and discrimination. So in addition to the sort of bleak financial outlook and all of that stuff, there's also a bleak social outlook that could be coming up, which I think we need to pay attention to as well.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a follow-up from one of the points you made earlier about the fact that some people are more sensitive to disgust and some people are less. Are the people who are more sensitive, do they show more dramatic changes in out-group attitudes during the pandemic?
So what typically happens is people who tend to be more sensitive to disgust tend to be slightly high in different types of biases. But there's something what we call a ceiling effect here, right? And so these people are already very high in how much disgust they feel. And that's probably being manifested in their daily lives. So there's not much room for them to go in terms of what more they can do. So I don't think those are the people necessarily who are going to be showing much more bias, let's say. I think it's the people with more wiggle room that will show more of it because they're going to be pushed into this uncomfortable space. The other interesting thing about people that are really high in disgust is they've probably been engaged in all of the safe behaviors anyway, right? People who are very disgust sensitives are the ones who are less likely to be touching things in the train. And they're the ones who are sort of obsessively washing their hands before this has happened. So they're ironically the safer people, right? Even though they don't necessarily feel that way. But they're also usually the people who will show more bias. But again, I think there's going to be a ceiling effect there. And they're not necessarily the ones whose behavior is going to change quite dramatically because of this.
There's a question here about how this is affecting the people who are being reacted to. So as opposed to those of us who are perhaps showing bias, on the other side, what's it do to the people when many people are reacting with fear and disgust towards them?
Yeah, I think that might be a unique experience for lots of people, but there are lots of people in this world who have those experiences almost daily, right? So for instance, depending on what part of the world I am and the time of day, when I walk down the street, people are used to crossing the street when they see me coming because of biases associated with my perceived social categories. And that's something that I've had to deal with most of my life. Similarly, if you've been a homeless person sitting on the street, you're used to people reacting that way. But there are lots of us for whom this is quite new, right? This feeling of people being terrified of us is something that we haven't encountered before. And it's very difficult to think about how do you deal with that, because what the research has showed is having people treat you like a fear stimulus is actually not great for your health. It sort of gets your heart rate elevated because now you're looking around thinking, where's the threat? Because you're reading it in their faces. And it also might start impacting how you see yourself. Now, I think in the time of COVID, those impacts will be much reduced because everybody is sort of having that experience. But it's something to think about as well, and something to realize that the reactions people are having towards you aren't necessarily about you personally. And this is something that I always tell myself when I see people having those reactions from me in normal times. It's because of the ideas in their heads, right? So it's nothing about you specifically, it's something about them. And again, that switching of perspective often helps. It reduces the sort of spiking heart rate you might typically get. And so I think there are ways of dealing with being the threatening stimulus, but it's also giving a lot of people insight into the experience that you might have as being someone who is often the recipient of those types of emotional responses.
We have time for maybe two quick questions left. And there was another follow-up from earlier where someone's asked, are kids more likely to experience long-lasting effects of this social distancing in terms of increased social anxiety than you and I?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So kids are very resilient and they're very, what we would call elastic. Their brains haven't finished developing, and so they can adjust much easier than we can. And so lots of parents, for instance, have been worried about their kids and what's it like for them being at home all of the time, but they'll quickly adjust to this, to be quite honest. I think the long-lasting impacts for children will be if there are changes that have happened that really impact their lives going forward. And so many of us, we remember what it's like to have face-to-face conversations and to be in very big groups at concerts or sporting events. And if those things never return to the way they used to be, then children won't have those experiences. So their reality is going to be very different. Children already are the ones who are dominant in technology, online and social media, and having these non-face-to-face interactions, these virtual interactions. If that propensity ticks up, again, it's going to have a long-lasting impact on them because it means they won't have the experiences that lots of us have had throughout our entire lives. So I don't think it's going to affect children in the moment. It really depends on what society looks like once we've gotten beyond this in terms of the impact it's going to have on children.
So the more normal we go back to, kids will just relearn that that's normal.
Exactly. Kids are very easily adaptable. And so they're not going to have this sort of psychologically scarring impacts that we think we're the ones who are being psychologically scarred, right? Because it's our lives that we've been used to forever that's been completely turned over, and we're having these strange emotions and we're performing these strange behaviors. But for children, it's not going to be as impactful in the short term, I think.
Fantastic. And the last thing that came up was just very practical for people who are experiencing this kind of anxiety. Couple quick, could you quick summarize a few of the things that they can do to help reduce their anxiety levels, make themselves feel a little better?
Sure. So just to recap, avoid learning experiences that teaches you it's a threatening world outside, which means don't look at the media, at least for a few hours before you go outside. It will reduce the anxiety. And even if you're inside, I think limiting the amount of media you consume is really helpful. The second thing is the distraction is real. And so if you can think about other things you can do to take your mind off of it, that will improve your mood as well. So having face-to-face virtual interactions with your friends where you sit and laugh, as Sophie recommended last week, is really going to be very helpful. And the third thing is to think differently about the situation, right? Realize that if you're following the guidelines, you are doing everything in your power to stay virus-free. So you will probably be protected. So there's no reason to be overly panicked about it. And so I think if you keep those three pillars going, it can reduce your anxiety. But it takes a lot of work. And again, the traditional things will also work as well. So meditation and mindfulness practices are going to be quite useful. Interacting with people, having positive social interactions are going to be useful because they give you a different learning experience with people. So those things which typically work in normal times are going to be effective now as well.
Well, thank you, Lasana. I mean, I really enjoyed that. I feel like I've learned an awful lot out of that too. There are a ton more great questions, actually, and I'm sorry that we didn't get to all of them, but we've run out of time. I would like to thank my guest, Dr. Lasana Harris. And I'd like to say, thanks, Lasana. Next week, we're going to be talking about the psychology behind what-if questions. What if Boris Johnson or Prince Charles had died from COVID? Or what if we hadn't closed the schools? Why do we love to ask these kind of questions that don't have real answers? And why are we so passionate that our answers for these questions are the correct answers? Join us next week to find out a little bit more about that. In the end, as I said, I'd just like to thank Lasana and thank our audience for tuning in today. Thank you all. Goodbye.
Bye.